Neverland Ranch, San Ynez Valley, California, April 2003. A journalist walked through the front gates. He had been granted a private tour, one of the rarest invitations in the entertainment world. He had prepared for what he expected to see. The carousel, the Ferris wheel, the private zoo, the theater that seated 50 people, the candy room. He did not prepare for what was standing in the main corridor. Life-sized, cast in bronze, eyes forward, body coiled, Bruce Lee. Not a poster, not a photograph, not a small figurine on a shelf between trophies. A full, human-scale bronze statue of Bruce Lee, standing inside Michael Jackson's private home. The home where Jackson ate his meals, where he rehearsed, where he slept. The journalist asked about it. He was told, Michael put it there himself. It's been there for years. Think about that. Of every object Michael Jackson could have placed in the corridor he walked through every single day, the most famous entertainer on earth, a man who could own anything, he chose a statue of a martial artist who died in 1973. Nobody asked why. Not the magazine profiles, not the 3-hour documentaries, not the biographers who spent years reconstructing his life. In 40 years of coverage, nobody stopped and asked the one question that unlocks everything. What did Bruce Lee mean to Michael Jackson? The answer is not what you think. It has nothing to do with fighting, nothing to do with movies, nothing to do with fame or legacy or two legends admiring each other from a distance. It has everything to do with a 4-second moment, a spotlight, a single move, and the one principle discovered in a martial arts notebook that made that moment possible. This is that story. To understand the connection, you need to understand the problem, because both men, Bruce Lee and Michael Jackson, were solving the exact same problem, from opposite directions, in different decades, with different bodies, in different rooms, and neither of them could fully explain it in words. Start with Bruce Lee, born November 27, 1940, Hong Kong. Weight at peak condition, 138 pounds, height, 5 feet 7 inches. By the time he was 18, he had been in over 20 documented street fights. Not training fights, not sparring sessions, real fights in alleys and on rooftops, where the consequences were broken bones and worse. His father, Lee Hoi Chuen, one of Hong Kong's most famous Cantonese opera performers, was alarmed enough to enroll his son in Wing Chun under the legendary Ip Man. What happened next confused everyone who knew Bruce Lee. The fighting did not change him. The philosophy underneath the fighting changed him. He discovered something that the great fighters had known for centuries, but rarely written down. The best fighters are not trying to overpower their opponent. They are trying to disappear. Not physically, mentally. They are trying to remove the thinking brain from the moving body, to reach a state where the body acts before the mind can interfere, supervise, or slow things down. Lee wrote about this constantly, page after page in his private notebooks. He called it by different names in different years. Sometimes he borrowed from Taoist philosophy, sometimes from Zen, but the core idea never changed. He wrote it precisely in Tao of Jeet Kune Do. The consciousness of self is the greatest hindrance to the proper execution of all physical action. Read that once more, slowly. Not ego, not arrogance, not nerves in the way most people describe nerves. The consciousness of self. He was describing the specific, crippling moment when a person becomes aware of themselves mid-action, and that awareness itself becomes the obstacle. The moment a fighter thinks, is my stance correct? Am I telegraphing? What does this look like? That is the exact moment the technique collapses. The brain's commentary on the movement destroys the movement. He spent 20 years building an entire fighting philosophy, Jeet Kune Do, around one goal, eliminating that interference. Now move to Michael Jackson, born August 29, 1958, Gary, Indiana. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already the frontman of the Jackson 5, already on national television, already being watched by millions. And from the very beginning, from his first professional performance at age 5, he had an intuition that most performers never develop even after decades on stage. He knew the difference. The difference between a performance that impresses people and a performance that moves people. The difference between a body executing choreography and a body that has become the music. He could feel it from the inside, the rare moments when everything disappeared. No audience, no cameras, no awareness of the lights above his head, no voice in his mind monitoring how the move looked from the 10th row, just the thing itself. He called it different things at different times. In one interview he said, "You don't think, you just become the music." In another, "When it's really right, I don't remember doing it. It just happens." He studied everyone who had ever reached that state. James Brown for footwork and raw power, Fred Astaire for the geometry of elegance, Charlie Chaplin for physical storytelling, Marcel Marceau for what the body communicates when it is completely still. And then, somewhere around 1972, in Los Angeles, he found Bruce Lee. According to Matt Fiddes, Michael Jackson's personal bodyguard and one of the UK's most recognized martial arts instructors, Jackson was a secret martial arts expert who was obsessed with studying Bruce Lee. Fiddes confirmed that Jackson had earned a 5th-degree black belt. He confirmed that Jackson had specifically studied Jeet Kune Do, Bruce Lee's own system. He confirmed that Michael Jackson had memorized Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee's 1973 film, word for word. Not scene by scene, word for word. Every punch, every pause, every moment of stillness before an explosion of movement. He watched that film the same way he watched James Brown footage. Not for entertainment, for the answer to a question he had been carrying his entire life. The question was, how do you get there? And how do you stay there? Here is what Michael Jackson saw when he watched Bruce Lee fight. He saw someone who did not announce themselves. Every great fighter telegraphs, even the good ones. They shift their weight, they narrow their eyes, they tighten the jaw, they breathe differently. Something in the body broadcasts what is coming, a signal so small that most people in a room miss it, but a trained opponent reads it before the mind processes it consciously. The signal and the strike are two separate events. Bruce Lee had eliminated all of it, not through tricks, not through misdirection, through a training philosophy that insisted the body and the action had to be a single event, not a decision followed by an execution, not a thought followed by a movement, just the movement, unannounced, unprefaced, pure. Dan Inosanto, Bruce Lee's most trusted student, the man who trained with him daily for years, the man who knew his habits, his notebooks, his morning routines, described it simply. When Bruce walked into a room, everything changed. Not because he did anything, because he was completely present. No part of him was elsewhere. No part of him was elsewhere. Sit with that. Most people, at any given moment, are partially somewhere else. They are monitoring how they appear to others in the room. They are replaying something that happened 2 hours ago. They are rehearsing what they will say next. They are running background calculations that have nothing to do with what is happening right now. The body is present. The attention is not. Bruce Lee had spent 15 years eliminating that background noise, not through willpower, not through concentration, but through a daily practice of becoming aware of the noise before it arrived, so that it had no purchase during the moment of action. Michael Jackson, watching Bruce Lee on screen in 1972, recognized it immediately, because he had felt it before. Not reliably, not on command, but in flashes, moments on stage, usually in small venues early in his career, when the music was loud enough and the crowd was close enough, and something clicked. Everything disappeared. The body just knew. He was not executing choreography. He was not thinking about the audience. He was not calculating the distance to the camera. He was the music, present, complete, nowhere else. He had felt that state. He could not manufacture it, and here was a man who could manufacture it at will, a man who had put words to what it felt like, and more importantly, had built a daily practice around how to get there. This is where the story gets specific, because what Bruce Lee did every morning was not what most people imagine when they picture his training. Yes, he ran miles before sunrise. Yes, he trained 6 hours a day. Yes, his physical conditioning was a level of documented precision that modern sports scientists still study. His routines from 1965, preserved in his personal archives, outline an intensity that would exhaust most professional athletes. But that was not the primary work. The primary work happened before any of it. Every morning, before the running, before the weights, before the forms, Bruce Lee sat down and he wrote. Not a journal, not a diary of feelings. He was conducting a daily audit of his own attention. He was asking himself every single morning one question. Where is my attention going that I have not chosen? He wrote about the thoughts that arrived uninvited, the calculations about how he was perceived, the replays of past confrontations, the rehearsals of future ones. He documented them not to resolve them, but to see them, to know them by name, because a distraction you can name loses its power. It becomes something you can put down deliberately, instead of something that arrives mid-action and dismantles everything. He wrote in one notebook, "The stillness in stillness is not the real stillness. Only when there is stillness in movement does the universal rhythm manifest." That is the principle. Not stillness before the movement, stillness within the movement. A mind so quiet that it creates no friction against what the body is doing, no lag, no commentary, no separation between the intention and the execution. Michael Jackson read this, studied this, trained toward this, for 10 years. Before March 25, 1983, before the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, before 87 million people, before 4 seconds that the world has watched 2 billion times and never fully understood. Here is what most people do not know about the Motown 25 performance. Michael Jackson almost did not perform Billie Jean that night. The Motown 25 special, Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever, was recorded at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium on March 25, 1983. It was a celebration of the label's 25th anniversary. Every major Motown artist had been invited. The Jackson brothers were scheduled to perform a medley of their old hits, a reunion piece, a nostalgia number, not a showcase. Michael Jackson was 24 years old. Thriller had already been released. Billie Jean was already climbing the charts. He was no longer a child act rotating through television variety shows. But the plan was the old material, the Jackson 5 songs, the hits from when he was 10. He agreed. And then, the night before, he made a decision that nobody around him fully understood. He was going to perform Billie Jean solo. After the medley, alone, in a single spotlight, no backing dancers, no elaborate stage design, just himself and the song. His brothers were skeptical, his management team was uncertain. But Michael Jackson had decided something beyond the set list that night. He had decided he was going to attempt something in front of a live audience at that scale that he had never successfully achieved before. He was going to try to disappear into the music completely, not perform presence, achieve it. Now here is the technical detail that changes how you understand everything that follows. The moonwalk, specifically the backslide that became its signature move, is, biomechanically, one of the most counterintuitive actions the human body can produce. Jeffrey Daniel of Shalimar had pioneered the foundational mechanics. Jackson had learned them and drilled them. He understood exactly what the body needed to do. Shift weight forward onto the ball of one foot, slide the other foot backward with the heel raised, lock the knee of the gliding leg, push and glide in a precise, controlled sequence. He could execute it in rehearsal, reliably. That was not the problem. The problem was that the moonwalk, more than almost any other move in Jackson's vocabulary, requires the brain to stop interfering entirely. Because the move is biomechanically counterintuitive, because the visual result, gliding backward while appearing to walk forward, directly contradicts what the body expects. Any moment of self-consciousness destroys the illusion. The instant your mind notices what your body is doing mid-move, your body hesitates. The hesitation is visible. The illusion collapses. Thousands of dancers have the mechanics. Almost none can deliver it at the level Jackson did that night. Not because of physical ability, because of mental state. This is the exact problem Bruce Lee had spent 20 years solving. Bruce Lee's one-inch punch, one of the most analyzed strikes in the history of martial arts, operates on the same principle. A full-force strike delivered from 1 inch of distance with zero wind-up, zero telegraph, zero preparation. The physics should not allow the force generated. But Lee could deliver it reliably, at will, with power that knocked opponents off their feet. Every researcher who has analyzed it reaches the same conclusion. Lee had eliminated the gap between intention and action. There was no moment of, now I will strike. There was only the strike. No supervisory function, no self-monitoring. The brain's commentary had been so completely trained out of the movement that the body acted before consciousness could arrive to observe, evaluate, and slow it down. The moonwalk requires the same elimination. The brain must trust the body completely. No correction, no monitoring, no awareness of the watching audience, no calculation of how it looks. The self must disappear. What remains is the movement. Backstage at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, 30 minutes before his slot, Michael Jackson stood alone. He had memorized Enter the Dragon word for word. He had trained in Jeet Kune Do. He had read the notebooks. He had spent 10 years building toward the state Bruce Lee described. The mind still, the body free. No part of him elsewhere. He walked out. The Jackson brothers finished their medley. Michael Jackson returned to the stage alone. A single spotlight came on. The Billie Jean instrumental opened. He did not move. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. He stood completely still, not performing stillness, not holding a pose for dramatic effect, achieving it. The difference is visible if you know what to look for. A performed pause is a held position with attention behind the eyes, calculating the moment to release. An achieved stillness is a state where the attention itself has gone quiet. The body stands, the mind makes no comment. Bruce Lee had written the description of this exact moment. He called it, not being tense, but ready. Not thinking, but not dreaming. Not being set, but flexible. 4 seconds of that, in front of 3,500 people in the room and 87 million watching at home. Then the body moved. Not he moved, the body moved. For 3 minutes and 58 seconds, there was no gap, no calculation, no awareness of the cameras, no monitoring of the audience, no performance of performance. Every movement, the spins, the footwork, the hat, the glove catch in the light, arrived without being announced, without preparation, without the self watching. And then the backslide. 2 seconds, weight forward, heel raised, knee locked, the impossible glide. The audience's reaction was not applause. It was something involuntary, something that the body produces before the brain has time to process what it just witnessed. A sound with no name, a collective intake of breath that became a roar. Fred Astaire, the man who had defined elegance in movement for 40 years, a man who did not give compliments easily, called Michael Jackson the next morning. He said, "You're a hell of a mover." That is the single highest on-record compliment Fred Astaire ever gave to another performer. Backstage, after the performance, Michael Jackson cried. He told Oprah Winfrey in a 1993 interview, "When I did Motown 25 and I did the Moonwalk for the first time, I was backstage crying afterwards because I was unhappy." He had wanted to hold the toe stand longer after the spin. He thought he had fallen short. 87 million people had just watched the most iconic dance performance in the history of popular music. And the man who performed it was in a back corridor, alone, certain he had not done enough. He walked to the parking lot. Outside the auditorium, in the night air of Pasadena, a 12-year-old boy was standing near the cars. He saw Michael Jackson. He had just watched the performance on a screen in the lobby. He walked over. He said, "You're amazing. Who taught you to dance like that?" Jackson told Oprah that was the first moment that night he felt like he had done a good job. Not the audience reaction, not the standing ovation, not the 3,500 people in the room whose response he could not even hear clearly over the monitors. A 12-year-old boy in a parking lot. Because children, as Jackson said, don't lie. Now here is the question that 40 years of coverage has never answered. Michael Jackson was asked about the moonwalk hundreds of times for the rest of his life. In interviews, in his autobiography, Moonwalk, published in 1988, in long-form conversations with Barbara Walters, with Oprah, with Martin Bashir, with journalists from every publication on Earth, he always described the mechanics, Jeffrey Daniel and the backslide, the white socks for visibility, the importance of the shoe sole, the rehearsal hours. He never described what happened in the 4 seconds before the move, not once. He never explained the stillness, never described what it feels like to stand in front of 87 million people and achieve complete internal quiet, never named the principle behind the achievement, never pointed to Bruce Lee and said, "This is where I found the answer." It is not because he was keeping a secret. It is because the thing he had learned cannot survive a description. Bruce Lee understood this problem his entire career. The principle defeats itself the moment you try to explain it technically. The moment you say stop thinking, the listener starts thinking about how to stop thinking, which is exactly the opposite of the destination. The description becomes the obstacle. Lee wrote around it for 20 years. He used metaphors, images, analogies. He wrote, "Do not think, feel. It is like a finger pointing at the moon. Do not concentrate on the finger, or you will miss all the heavenly glory." He spent his life pointing at something he could not name directly. Michael Jackson spent his life moving like something he could not name. The statue in Neverland's corridor was not decoration. It was not fan memorabilia from a teenage obsession. It was a daily reminder, placed in the exact hallway where Jackson walked every single morning, of the principle that had rebuilt his relationship with performance, the principle that had made Motown 25 possible. A bronze figure standing in the corridor saying, without words, "You already know what this requires. Go find it again today." The principle is this: your greatest obstacle as a performer, as a fighter, as a dancer, as an athlete, as anyone whose body and mind must act as a single instrument, is not lack of skill, not lack of rehearsal, not nerves in the conventional sense. It is the version of yourself that watches yourself perform, the layer of awareness that arrives mid-action and begins to comment. Bruce Lee called it the consciousness of self. Michael Jackson called it thinking too much. They are precisely the same thing. Here is what Bruce Lee actually did every single day to reach that state, because this is where the story stops being inspiration and becomes instruction. People expect a montage, 1,000 repetition drills, punching bags, sparring. And yes, Lee trained 6 hours a day at peak. His 1965 training documents, preserved in his personal archives, outline a conditioning program that modern sports scientists describe as decades ahead of its time. He ran miles before sunrise. He performed strength work that had no name in mainstream fitness culture. His physical preparation was documented, measurable, extraordinary. But that was not the primary work. The primary work happened before any of it. Every morning, before the running, before the weights, before the forms, Bruce Lee sat on the floor of whatever room he was in, and he wrote. Not a journal of events, not reflections on feelings, a daily audit of his own attention. He was asking himself one question: where is my attention going that I have not chosen? He wrote about the thoughts that arrived without invitation, the calculations about how others perceived him, the replays of past confrontations, the rehearsals of future ones. He wrote about them not to resolve them, but to see them clearly, to know them by name. Because a distraction you can name loses its grip. It becomes something you can put down deliberately, the way you put down a tool when the work is done, instead of something that arrives mid-performance and dismantles everything you have trained. He wrote in his notebook, not being tense but ready, not thinking but not dreaming, not being set but flexible, liberation from the uneasy sense of confinement. That is not a description of a resting state. That is the description of the active, disciplined work of clearing the mind before action. Not relaxation, not meditation in a passive sense. An intentional daily practice of learning to recognize the noise so that it could not arrive unannounced during the moment that mattered. Michael Jackson built his own version of this practice. He rehearsed differently from any performer his collaborators had worked with. Not to perfect the sequence. By the time he was 20, the sequences were already perfect. He rehearsed to find the point where the sequence disappeared, where the body no longer needed to be led by the mind, because the body knew more than the mind about what came next. He would rehearse a segment until he felt the click, until the gap closed, until there was no space between intention and execution. Then he would stop that segment and move on. Not more repetitions. The right state. And then stop before the state became mechanical again. Both men arrived at the same architecture through different doors. Lee through martial arts philosophy, Taoist thought, and 20 years of private writing. Jackson through obsessive study, physical rehearsal, and the bronze reminder standing in his corridor every morning. The architecture is this: presence is not a talent. It is not a gift. It is not something you either have or you do not have. It is a discipline, a daily practice of learning to recognize the thing that takes you out of the moment, so that in the moment that matters, the 4 seconds before the move, the 1 inch before the strike, there is nothing between you and the action, nothing watching, nothing commenting, nothing elsewhere, just the thing itself. Now here is the part that most people skip, because the question that follows all of this is not, how do I get there? The question is, what does it cost to stay there? Bruce Lee understood the cost better than almost anyone who has written about him. He died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. Enter the Dragon, the film that Michael Jackson would memorize word for word, was released 29 days later, on August 19th, 1973. It became one of the highest-grossing martial arts films in history. He never saw the response. He never knew that a 15-year-old boy in Los Angeles was going to watch it on loop in a dark room, studying the way a man moved when the self had been completely removed from the movement. The cost of what Bruce Lee had built was the extraordinary, unrelenting daily work of maintenance. The practice on the floor did not end. The notebook did not close. The morning audit did not stop. Because the noise does not go away permanently. The consciousness of self does not disappear after you have found the principle. It returns every morning, reconstituted, requiring the same attention again. Lee wrote about this without apology. I am learning to understand rather than immediately judge or to be judged. I cannot blindly follow the crowd and accept their approach. I will not allow myself to indulge in the usual manipulating game of role creation. The people who watch Bruce Lee perform, on screen, in demonstrations, in documented real confrontations, were watching the result of daily renewal. Not natural talent, daily renewal. Michael Jackson understood the same cost. He rehearsed until the week before major performances because the state he was trying to reach required constant maintenance. When he stopped rehearsing, it did not mean the body forgot the moves. It meant the state became harder to access. The gap reopened. The self returned to its monitoring position. And the performance that followed was technically perfect and emotionally hollow. He would rather cry in a parking lot after Motown 25, certain he had done it imperfectly, than deliver a technically flawless performance that he could feel from the inside was empty. That standard, that refusal to accept the technically correct but spiritually absent performance, is the standard Bruce Lee had written into every notebook page. It is why the statue stood in the corridor, not as inspiration, as a standard, a daily reminder of what the work actually requires. On May 16, 1983, 53 days after the performance was recorded, Motown 25, Yesterday, Today and Forever, broadcast on NBC. 87 million people watched. Fred Astaire called that morning. Mikhail Baryshnikov, the greatest classical ballet dancer of his generation, said publicly that the performance was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen a human body do. Quincy Jones, who had produced Thriller, said he understood for the first time that night what Michael Jackson was actually capable of. None of them could fully explain why. Because the thing that made that performance unrepeatable is not the moonwalk. The moonwalk is a technique. Techniques can be taught. Techniques can be learned. Thousands of dancers have learned the mechanics of the backslide. Thousands can perform it competently. What they cannot perform is what happened in the 4 seconds before the move. They cannot achieve, in front of 87 million people, the absolute stillness that Bruce Lee spent his life describing. The stillness in movement, the presence without performance, the action without the self observing the action. That is why no performance in 43 years has replicated it. Not the technical move, the 4 seconds before it. The bronze statue was sold at auction in Beverly Hills on April 13, 2009, following Michael Jackson's death on June 25th of that year. It was photographed on display. The catalogue entry described it simply as a statue featuring Bruce Lee, owned by Michael Jackson. No further explanation. No one who wrote the catalogue entry asked what it meant. But now you know. 2 men, different bodies, different decades, different art forms. One finding the answer through the philosophy of a fight that never happens. One finding it through the preparation for a performance that must. Both arriving at the same place, the understanding that the highest expression of any physical art is the moment the self gets out of the way. Bruce Lee wrote it. Michael Jackson danced it. And somewhere in the space between the notebook and the spotlight, in the 4 seconds before the body moved and the world changed, both of them were pointing at the same thing. The question is not whether you understand it. The question is whether, when the moment comes, your moment, whatever form it takes, you will be present enough to let it happen, or whether you will be too busy watching yourself to notice it arrive.